Hello, welcome everybody. We are going to be talking about composting today with Keep Growing Detroit. My name is Keto. I will be teaching the class today. We had a guest speaker, Ross Harris, who was going to be with us, but he had something come up this morning, so he had to cancel. But no fret. I have a lot of experience with composting and definitely can answer all the questions that you guys might have. So before we go ahead and get started, I'd like to do a little survey with everybody. So I'm gonna go ahead and try and get this rolling here. So if I go with this. Oh no, it's not working for me. Hold on one second. Okay, I'm not gonna fool with it. It's not working right for me. Anyways, so let me go ahead and pop up the slides. One second here. So the slides here. I don't know. Okay, do you guys see that?
Yeah.
Okay, are there any boxes in the way or anything? You can see the whole screen?
We can see it. I can see it. Sorry.
Okay. All right. Well, today we are talking about composting. Looks like we got a bit of a small, hold on. We got a smallish group. So I definitely, feel free to chime in with questions as we go along. I don't think we really need to do the chat so much. So, as we're going, if you have questions, please feel free to jump in. So compost, the black gold. So we'll start out with why we would want to compost. There's a number of reasons that compost is really valuable for us gardeners. It is a great addition to our gardens to support the living soil. So we'd like to talk about living soil as gardeners and farmers because it really emphasizes the reality that there are millions of little microorganisms and creatures living in the soil that help us and do a lot of the work to keep our soil healthy and in turn keep our plants healthy. So incorporating organic matter is another kind of term for finished compost, or in soil analysis, that's a term. So we always want to have a high organic matter in the mix with the soil, silt and clay and all those other things that are present in the soil. Other reasons are, it's simply put, it's helps you manage your garbage out of the garden, so to speak, or manage the waste out of the garden. So whether that's grass clippings or weeds without seeds, or weeds that are not invasive, or all the other plant material at the end of the season when we're putting our gardens to bed. slowly processing that and recycling it essentially so we can put it back in our garden. I've been doing a lot of that in the past couple of weeks. We just rebuilt a compost pile at my house, rebuilt a bin that and I'll tell you about it a little bit more as we go along, but I was trying to work out a plan to minimize the ability for rodents to access it, which is something that you have to navigate a little bit. And then otherwise, composting is a really great way to keep food waste or plant material out of the landfill. So if we were to put this stuff into the garbage, it can contribute to anaerobic decomposition, which creates methane, which is a greenhouse gas, and can be problematic. So it's at the same time, it's our contribution to a better planet. Is another reason to be composting. So essentially, compost is nature's way of recycling. So it's basically putting together a recipe of certain amount of this type of material: browns, leaves, straw, woody materials, and then greens, grass, food scraps, manure, etc. And to let those decompose along with the other ingredients like air and water, and slowly they'll decompose and create this finished product, which is our farmer's gold, so to speak, our black gold. So basically, microorganisms and macroorganisms consume the plant material, and then what they leave behind is the finished product. Worms are another really helpful character in the landscape of composting. Finished compost looks like black dirt and smells very earthy. I just want to make a point that there's it's different than topsoil. So soil is made out of sand, silt, and clay. And then compost is organic matter. So like if you were starting a new raised bed, for instance, we would recommend that you would fill the raised bed with a combination of topsoil and compost. Compost also is really awesome at improving water absorption and retention. So it's helps keep water available for plants to grow, and it's a necessary thing that plants need to grow. Basically it has the ability to act kind of like a sponge. So that's a valuable thing for plant development. Whereas like if you had a really sandy soil, for instance, then the water tends to just drain through sandy soil and not drying out relatively quickly, and plants don't have that access to it. So compost is pretty cool stuff. So essentially, the ingredients of a successful compost pile would be browns, which we would say are the woody stems, leaves, woody, brown in color materials, greens. So those are the kind of the foods. There's air. And air is a very important thing for those microbes to be able to do what they need to do. Water, and ultimately, and then the naturally occurring life that's present on all of these materials that we're using to build a compost pile. All right, so while we're at this point, let's take a second, and if you could put in the chat, if you have the ability, if you could put in the chat, if you are currently composting or not. Are you, say, currently composting, brand new to composting, been composting for years. If you could just drop that in the chat. Okay, Sharon Luckerman. Been composting, but haven't done it for years. Lorraine's is currently composting. Sharon Matthews is brand new. Anne is brand new. Anna is doing it right now. Fanny has just got a new composter. Joanne's been composting for years. Helen is new to compost and she's got 3 bins. Susan and Susan Stoller. Oh, yeah, Susan in the room. Susan's a very seasoned gardener. She's been doing it a long time. Elnora, new to composting. Darielle, brand new to composting. And then Mark and Judy are currently composting, but they don't know that much. And then Joy is a longtime composter. Okay, great. Thanks for that, guys. Just getting a sense of who's in the room here.
Keto,
Yeah.
I have a question. I have been composting. I have a bin, but I do not put grass clippings in there because I use different chemicals on my grass. So I was afraid to put that into the compost bin.
You're talking about like herbicides for the weeds and stuff?
Yeah, when my lawn is mowed, I don't put that mowed grass into the compost. I bag it up and take it, to the well, they pick it up. Right. But I was wondering, would that?
I think that's a fair assessment. I wouldn't, if you have herbicides in particular in there, that could be problematic.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. Okay,
good.
Okay. So and then there's a question here from Tish, can leaves go into the compost pile, which is a perfect, segue into this next slide here. So let's get into the details of the ingredients that we're going to be using for building a compost pile. So there are many ways, and so there's many ways to approach composting in terms of like how to build a pile or having a compost or a compost bin, or like there's different systems, and I have some images and illustrations that will help us in the conversation. But let's just dig into like, some of the materials that we're going to be working with to get these going. So essentially, for when we're getting ready to build the compost. So essentially, how I like to approach it is I stockpile the source materials. So there's the browns and the greens. So we're talking about browns right now. So browns are essentially plant-based materials that are high in carbon and quote unquote mostly dead. So these are types of things that that if you stuck them in a pile and left them, they probably wouldn't stink too much. If you left them for a number of months, that wouldn't be problematic. So examples of these would be leaves. Leaves are a great one, and you can stockpile, every fall, or I stockpile leaves. I just go around my neighborhood and pick up bags from my neighbors, and I put a bunch of the bags and I store a bunch of the bags for when I'm ready to build a pile. So leaves are great. Wood chips work, but they take a long time to break down. Straw is another great one. So out of these 3, I would say leaves and straw are some of the best options for brown materials to be contributing to your compost pile. And then next would be green materials. So these anything green in color, or basically things that tend to be higher in nitrogen. And then another way to think about them, if you put them in a pile and left them for an extended time, they would start to smell bad. So that would be the grass clippings, coffee grounds, weeds.
Don't forget that.
Oh, yes, for sure. Coffee grounds. Yep. Weeds without seeds. Garden waste, like old, lettuce or plants that you've pulled out and they're no longer useful. If you want to get fancy with it, you can go to a brewery and get the spent grain from a brewery and put that in your compost pile. Kitchen scraps. So all those things would be the greens. And then the other ingredients would be air. So air is essentially helps the microbes, the little creatures that are doing the work, to have what they need to thrive. A pile that is, for example, a pile that's too wet, or if you had a bunch of leaves, or it's just really too compacted, it can become essentially anaerobic. And this causes the pile to become stinky and slow, and slows down the decomposition process. So, you can try and make air by, periodically when you're building your compost pile, to incorporate sticks, stems, or otherwise, right? So we'll get into building the pile in a minute here. We're just talking about the concepts, and we'll talk about the different ways that you could approach building a pile. And then finally, water. Water, basically a lack of water is often, limiting the development of heat in a compost pile. So essentially, when you build a compost pile, it will heat up because of the activity of the microbes, and it'll have a few different stages. But there will be times in its process that you can, especially in the cooler parts of the year, that you can actually see steam coming off of your compost pile, and that is a good indication that your compost pile is doing what it's supposed to be doing. So water is just one of those things that just, I guess, similar to, like, plants aren't going to grow without access to water. The microbes also need that, and so that the moisture inside of a pile helps it continue to be active and to break down. And so watering your compost pile is on a regular basis is a good idea. And particularly trying to get water into the center of the pile, because oftentimes water will slough off if you just watering the top. So, or as you're building it, to incorporate water into the pile. And then finally, the life that, and this is naturally occurring stuff that's all over those different materials. And they could be all these little creatures that are on this image here: actinomyces, molds and fungi, nematodes, protozoa, rotifers, ants, soil flatworm, all kinds of stuff. All these things, they go inside the pile, they eat that stuff, they slowly break it down, and ultimately get us to our into our final product of compost. And then, finally, the things that you should not put in your compost pile are animal products, no meats, no bones, no oils or fats, definitely no weeds with seeds, and definitely no weeds with invasive roots, such as the images here of quackgrass and bindweed. Those could be a huge problem. And actually, if you're not careful and you do have those in your compost pile, then you could be spreading, when you're ultimately putting the compost around your garden, can be a problem, spreading those weeds around, and not a good thing. And then, so let's talk a little bit about building a compost pile. So, there's a number of different ways. There's bins, and there's tumblers. You can do it very simply, and we'll show some images in a bit about the different types of composting systems. But essentially, when you're building out something to be an active compost pile, you want to have it large enough that the pile itself ideally is approximately the size of a washing machine when you're building the pile. So the concept here is that you're not just like continually throwing stuff onto this pile, like when you have a bucket full of scraps from your kitchen or something, that you would be stockpiling, you know, your browns and your greens. And then when you have enough stuff to work with, you build out a pile that's about that size. And the idea there is that needs that much surface area to really become active and break down it at a good rate. That said, composting, you know, in a very, you know, in a very simplistic way, just happens. Composting happens, you know. It's like instead of you know, compost is nature's way of recycling. And so if you ultimately, if you throw these things in a pile, they will break down over time. But if you don't do it in a intentional way, it may take a lot longer for the decomposition to happen, for that stuff to break down into the final product. So we're really trying to, to have a really thriving pile to build it out to that larger size. So choose a spot in your, if you're new and you haven't started yet, I would recommend choosing a place that is, kind of out of the way. Compost piles aren't always the prettiest thing, but somewhere towards the back of the garden or off to the side, and then having, and considering a space for storing some of your stockpiled stuff. And that's where, like, you could have a 3-bin system, where it's, people will build out a 3-bin system out of pallets, out of like those shipping pallets that you see around town that people that they use to store stuff on, and you can get those for free. And they make a really, simple, you can make a simple 3-bin system out of those with 3 bays. So it could be a bay for the browns, a bay for the greens, and then the bay for actually building out the pile that will ultimately, decompose into your final product. You can also store source materials in bins or buckets. For instance, I at home, I have a 5-gallon bucket that I throw all my kitchen scraps in, and then I have a few of them, and I'll just store those buckets until I'm ready to go out and build up my pile. Okay, so now let's talk about the recipe, about how to put it all together. So like I had mentioned, we're stockpiling those browns and greens, and essentially the basic recipe is generally you want to have 3 parts brown to 1 part green by volume. So like if you're using a 5-gallon bucket to measure, you would or approximate, you would do 3 5-gallon buckets of browns, of straw or of leaves, to one 5-gallon bucket of grass clippings, for example, or kitchen scraps. And you're just layering browns layer, greens layer, kind of like this image here. You're just layering kind of like a lasagna, one then the other. And incorporating, we were talking about air, so like if you have some sticks and twigs, throwing a little bit of those in there to create airspace inside the middle of the pile is a great idea. You would also, having a hose on hand and watering as you go is a really good idea to get a good active compost pile going. And then once it's built, you can basically, there's a few options. You can either leave it there for a while and and just water it periodically and just let it do its thing, and it'll slowly decompose, and you'll see it reduce in size. So a full compost bin, after it's fully decomposed, will actually reduce down in volume to about 1/3 of what it initially was. So as all those microorganisms are doing their work, they really break that material down in volume to about a third the size of what the initial pile was built to look like. If you want it to break down more quickly, you can turn the pile. So you can basically take probably the best tool for this is a pitchfork. So you would just pitchfork all of the stuff out of the compost pile, and then, you know, kind of mixing it up as you go, and then pitchfork it back in. And you don't need to worry about the layering. So at that point, what you might do in the midst of that, depending on how much you'll see, you know, when the pile is new, you'll see the banana peels, and you'll see the orange, you know, the orange peels, and you'll see the full blades of grass, and you'll see the straw still looks like straw. But as it starts to get finished, as it starts to get towards its final product, it'll look like that black soil, but it'll be kind of mixed up. So like at that point, you can, as you're turning the pile, you can start to screen out or filter some of that finished product. And I'll show you a few tools about how to do that in a bit. How we doing? Any questions?
Question was about the green, for not using grass. Then I was supposed that we could use what other product, I'm new at this, that we use that is green, dark green.
Right. So the green, when we talk about greens, we're talking about greens like in quotes. So it doesn't actually have to be the color green, but the concept is it's something that's high in nitrogen. So that could be
Coffee grounds.
Coffee
Coffee
grounds.
grounds. Okay.
It could be weeds out of the garden, again, that don't have
Without
seeds on them.
seeds.
Correct. It could be kitchen scraps, you know, anything that is organic, you know, basically anything that comes from a plant could be incorporated. That's, you know, that is it is more fresh.
What about pineapple seed, like the shell of a pineapple, something like that? What about like melon?
Right. Yep.
Of...
Yep. All of those things. I mean, pineapple, the husk of a pineapple, well, the top of the pineapple might take a little longer to break down, but yes, you can incorporate all those things.
Okay.
Yeah.
But not cooked vegetation.
Right. Okay. Nothing cooked.
Yeah. I mean, that's the general recommendation. My personal experience is like having some of that in the mix. Like if you had like, okay, you cooked some potatoes, you had leftovers, you forgot about them, they sat in your back of your refrigerator for a while and they got moldy, you can throw those in the compost pile. There's enough, you know, other fresh greens and browns to compensate, then it's probably just fine. I mean, even like, I'm not recommending that you put you know, animal materials, like that's the reason that we don't do that is because it, you know, attracts rodents and it can get really foul and stinky. But there are on large farms, people will, I've known farmers who had an animal die, they had a goat die, and they just buried it in the compost pile, and it, you know, the compost pile decomposed the entire creature. And so that's, you know, that's nature at work. But for our purposes in the garden, we're not going to do that because of like the potential for foul odors and that kind of thing. Okay, any other questions?
Yes, I basically just build one big pile and with grass and then leaves and mix them up, layers of that, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And I'm not exactly sure if it's actually decomposing.
Yeah.
It's way more than a square yard.
Right. So I mean, it's a management thing. Essentially, you're trying to, if you keep adding new stuff to the top, then like it's hard to get to the finished product. I might stockpile that stuff, the newer stuff, like get it to build out one, or, break it down to the size of about a washing machine. And then let that do its work for a while before you add in stuff again, because ultimately, and it could be a routine if you're not, if this is more of a waste management thing for you, then you could just like once or twice a year, break down the whole pile, take out, and sift and separate the finished product and rebuild the pile with the stuff, that is unbroken down, basically.
So what you would recommend would be that instead of adding more onto the stockpile, create another stockpile.
Yeah, I mean, if you have the space, you could build another bin and fill that, or you could just store the stuff, let the current pile decompose, and then start over again. So, I mean, if you keep adding stuff to the top, then when you want to try and get to the finished product, then you have to like manage getting the stuff,
Would that be the reason why we would turn it every other week, turning it, trying to flip it from the top to the bottom?
Yeah, that'll definitely, it incorporates a lot more air, and then you're adding water, and so that'll expedite the decomposition process. But that said, that's also more work. So
Yeah.
The composting, the decomposition process is accelerated by when the pile is turned and tossed and recombined and all that kind of thing. The more you do it, the faster it'll break down. But that's, another thing to do, another activity to do in the garden, and do you have the time to do that? It's just a matter of what your ultimate goal is. If your ultimate goal is to get to the finished product, then turning, getting your stuff for your garden, then turning it more often. If your ultimate goal is more about waste management and the compost at the end is a bonus, then you don't have to turn it quite so often.
Keto, I have a question.
Yeah.
If you wanted to do a natural way of repelling certain insects or animals, could you add those elements to your compost bin? Like they say, mice don't like mint, and some animals don't like the smell of human hair. Could you add that to repel?
Yeah. I don't think that's going to do a whole lot. I mean, maybe kind of, sort of. I would be more, it would be more if you were we'll talk about, I know there's definitely questions about rodents and pests. So I'm going to hold that off for a second, but let's definitely come full circle to that. And basically it's about how you build out and how you manage the pile is going to be the best tool for managing for rodents and other creatures. So let's come back to that in a little bit. Okay, Susan, you had your hand up.
Yeah. If anyone is building a pallet bin, it's really important to raise up the bottom and constantly keep an airspace between probably the height of a cement block. The reason is that tree roots will find your compost pile. And then when you go to turn it, you're hacking through these heavy, persistent tree roots.
Right. That's if I guess that's if trees are nearby.
They don't have to be very close. They'll find the compost pile.
Right.
Anyway, yeah. So that's something. Another tip for kitchen waste, so that you don't have fruit flies in your house, keep your compost container in the freezer, and then when it fills up, take it out to the pile.
Yeah, that's a good one.
And that helps break down the fibers too of the materials that you're composting.
Great. Yeah. Okay, so let's keep going a little bit here. So how do I know when compost is done? Compost, essentially, it'll look like black dirt when when you get to that finished product, but it'll always have, typically it'll have, bits and pieces of other things, in there, like, you can see in my hand here, there's twigs and stems, and so you need to sift, you need to sift it to separate it. There's a couple different ways you can sift to get to, to separate the final product from the stuff that's not decomposed yet. So here's a real simple one that I use. One of the ones that I use in my garden. And it's basically, I took a milk crate and I took some 1/4-inch hardware cloth and I put it in the bottom of the milk crate. And then I'll scoop, some of that compost into the milk crate. And then I'll use this directly over my planting beds when I'm ready to incorporate compost into a planting. And I just basically shake that crate around, and that lets all the fine finished compost through, and then leaves the things that are not decomposed, the leaves and twigs you can see in the crates here, leaves those behind. Another one you can use is, I don't think I have an image of it, but you can build a frame, 4x8 wooden frame out of 2x4s, and attach larger holes. Like you could put chicken wire on it, or 1-inch holes are fine, and basically cover the whole face of that, and then lean it against a fence or lean it against something. So you have this big, screen that's at an angle, and basically you toss your compost to the top of it, and as it rolls down, most of the finished stuff falls through underneath the screen, and then the bigger stuff rolls to the bottom of the screen. And that I use that at my house. There's this old grate that was laying around from when I moved in, and that works real great. And I use it all the time. I have it set up right next to my compost pile, so when I'm ready to sift, I just toss, I'm just tossing it up, and it filters out real nicely. So how do we use compost? Essentially, we're going to try and add approximately a 5-gallon buckets. Generally we want to incorporate compost anytime we do a planting. It's just a great idea as a general rule. It's not required. Plants will grow without it, but in terms of adding organic matter to the soil and the benefits of that for the water retention and the fertility that it provides to the plants, which I haven't even mentioned yet. It's also a fertilizer, yes. And I'm sorry I haven't even mentioned that yet, even though I think most folks know that. But essentially, a general rule of thumb is about adding about a 5 gallons bucket worth for a 4x8 area. Anytime you do a planting, you can also do what's called a side dressing, is basically, half a cup or a cup's worth of compost at the base of a plant is a good idea. You can incorporate it into potting soil. So if you're doing any kind of containers or pots, mixing this with the potting mix, mixing your finished compost is a really great addition. And then finally, you could make a compost tea. There are, that's a kind of a whole class in itself, but essentially a compost tea, very simply, is basically, soaking some compost. You can use a paint strainer or an old burlap bag, fill it with compost, soak it in water for 24 hours, and use that liquid to water in your plants. And that's a good way to transport some of the nutrients and beneficial stuff into your garden. Okay, so now we're getting into troubleshooting, maybe some problems. So with the compost pile, probably one of the ones that you want to be, well, all these are important. First two are probably the most important, is bad smells. You know, you don't want, like, nobody wants to go out into their garden and be smelling, you know, stinky decomposing vegetables. And so there are a number of strategies for that, but essentially the biggest one is just to add more carbon, or add carbon every time you add that stuff to the pile, based on how you're managing it. So essentially, you know, covering up whatever, when you put that stuff that smells, that's the greens that are maybe intense smelling, when you put those on top of the pile, you're going to put on your carbon materials on top of those, like, so your shredded, your leaves, your straw, even, you know, some of the soil out of your garden. You just want to essentially encapsulate the stuff that smells bad, and that usually works pretty good. You can also turn more often, and that turning of the pile will help with smells. So now we're talking about pests. So probably the biggest one that nobody wants to see in their garden, but you know, we live in the city, is rats. So the two best strategies for managing for rats would be: one, turning your pile often. Two, making sure, so the rats are going after something that's edible, one, and then two, you know, they may see that as a potential spot that they can make a home. So you can address the edible thing by making it really unappetizing to them. So when you are, for instance, if you're stockpiling kitchen scraps out of your garden, you can kind of do what Susan was talking about, where you could freeze those kitchen scraps, so that makes them less appealing to rats. I'll fill the buckets with water, and it'll kind of ferment and get funky and not really edible to mammals. That intensifies the odor factor, but you know, for managing the rodents, I think it's a good trade-off. And then how you build or like the type of bin you build, combined with or use. So if you have a bin, like some of these bins are closed on all sides, so there's no way to access. So the bin that I just built, that's just something that we're really trying to manage at my house. Is not, we have rats in our neighborhood, and it's not very appetizing to look out my kitchen window and see rats running around. So what we did was, I did a base. I did the bottom of the compost bin with cinder blocks on the flat side facing up, and then I used cattle panels, which you can get from Harbor, or not, you can get from Tractor Supply, to build out the frames for the wall or the back, which you could similarly do that with pallets. And then I put some wire mesh along the inside liner of that. So essentially, there's, with the way that it's set up, there's no, from the sides and the back, there's not really anywhere that the rats could chew through or dig through to get into the sides of the pile. And then on the front, I'm just turning it really often to discourage their needs. So as long as I don't, if they don't have any access from the sides and from the back, and I see the activity on the front, there's not really anywhere where they could be building a nest. And then I'm managing their the food source, like that. There's nothing that's appetizing to them because I'm processing it with the water and such. And then if your compost, and then the other troubleshooting things is, if your compost pile is not heating up or does not seem to be breaking down, is to take some time and turn it, adding water, turning it more often. Okay, more questions.
Cato, this is Sharon Matthews. Didn't mention anything about manure. When is that and when can that be added, or if it needs to be added at any point?
Manure is a terrific addition to a compost pile. Usually when it's used, it's like fresh manure, from a farm, but I don't think in the city, it's not a very practical thing unless you, like if you had chicken coops, when you cleaned out your chicken coops, like usually you line the inside of a chicken coop with straw, and then, they poop and all that on the straw, and then you periodically, clean that out, and you can incorporate that into a compost pile, and it works wonderfully. If you're talking about like manure that you would get in bags, it's kind of an unnecessary step. It will add like microbes and microorganisms that may help you expedite the decomposition in your pile.
Mhm.
But purchasing it just for that purpose, I don't think is it just seems it's unnecessary. So now we're talking, and I have some images of some different types of compost piles, just to like give you, some ideas of what you might use. This first image is like, if you have a lot of space, it's just kind of like the open pile, building it up, really simple, layering on those things, and turning it from time, and then you can simply turn it over to a pile next to it, so to speak. Not very neat and tidy, probably not very aesthetically pleasing. So if you have a community garden out, in a neighborhood, I wouldn't necessarily recommend it, just because you want to, have the garden look presentable and not get any complaints from people. This is probably the second slide here is probably one of the most practical compost bin systems, because it's, materials are relatively free, or if not, they're cheap. You can usually find pallets around, and if you look at this lower left image, they used some of those green tea stakes that in the corners, and then pounded those in the ground, and then used chicken wire, or I'm sorry, used some kind of wire or zip ties or something to attach the pallets to that. And then you can see it when there's a two bin system, and down here they're stockpiling the leaves on the left, and then I think looks like on the right they're just adding, that's the finished pile, and just adding the greens to that, and adding the browns on top as necessary. So this is a real great one. Chicken wire bins. This is a real simple one, and you can, there's a number of different ways you could do this, with different sizes of either chicken wire or fencing material that you would get at the hardware store. It's also a great option for stockpiling browns. Like if you want kind of a neat and tidy spot to like put all your leaves and straw for when you're trying to build out your other compost bin, this is a practical way to store leaves and straw for that purpose. And this is, you can move, it's relatively easy to move around. So like if you wanted just to, you can take the wire off, put it in a new spot, and and then turn the pile back into the bin. So that, for that reason, that's kind of functionally helpful. Here's some other ideas using straw bales and just making a square, or using logs or cinder blocks. If you're really serious about pests, about trying to avoid having any issues with pests, it'd be a slight expense, but building out something like this with the cinder blocks it looks neat and tidy. It's, minimizes the accessibility for the rodents, especially if you have those cinder blocks on the bottom. And then in the upper left, that's basically a 4-panel made out of 2x4s, and that's a real mobile option as well. And then, not quite a compost bin setup, but this is another kind of composting method. And this is really useful if you have a spot where you are intending to, it's a new spot, it's just grass right now or something, and you want to get it ready to start some garden beds. You can do the lasagna composting method, which is essentially layering, basically layering the compostable materials right over where you ultimately want to have the garden. So you would lay down, first you would lay down cardboard right on top of the grass to smother the grass. And then you would weigh that down with layers of leaves and other compostable materials, straw, grass, maybe even some finished compost. The food scrap option wouldn't really be ideal here. It would be more like grass clippings or straw or and leaves, just because it's going to be kind of unsightly, and they won't decompose as readily. This takes about 3 to 6 months to really break down. So like if you were starting some new beds, maybe you would set this up in the fall with the intention of starting up, planting in those beds in the spring. And then finally, there's the products, the purchased bins and compost turners. Some of these have open bottoms, some of them have closed bottoms. The one in the lower right is intended that you would fill it and then roll it. There's also like ones with it's like a drum and you can use a hand crank and turn it. My experience with these is they're just not very convenient to turn. If you are managing waste out of your kitchen, like say you're just trying to manage your food scraps and you just want, a convenient place that's, somewhat pest free, then I would, this might be a good option for you. But the rollers and the tumblers, in my experience, get heavy relatively quickly and hard to turn or hard to roll. So like, you can only fill them so much before, you can't fill them to the brim because it's going to be almost too hard to turn. So management is, I don't like none of these. I would never use any one of these in my house because it's not very convenient for what my purposes are in wanting to have, more focused on the finished product of the compost. And I have a lot more volume of waste in my garden between the leaves and everything else that there's just not enough room in these bins to do what I would need them to do. They have their applications, but just manage it, ultimately it comes back to like, what's your intention? Are you trying to manage for just manage your waste, or are you trying to get to the final product of the compost? So that's what I have for slides. So if you have any questions about any one of these things, or if we want to dig in, let's open it up for conversation.
Hey, Keto, how you doing?
Good.
That's good. I have a question. So how much water would you put on your pile, like a week? Do you like just look at it and see, make sure it's kind of salty looking, or like how do you estimate what's a good amount of water to spray?
Well, so good question. at the, and just to reemphasize, initially, when you're building the compost pile is I would say the most important time to be trying to like wet it all down. Like you don't want it to be like muddy, but you want it to be saturated. So as you're building it, so that all the moisture, there's moisture in the center of the pile. Once the pile is completed, just few minutes of just kind of watering down the whole thing, trying to get it, if you can try, even if you make it a little divot in it, like what tends to happen if the pile is kind of rounded at the top, if you're watering, the water will just kind of roll over and off of the top before really penetrating deep. So if you kind of dig out the center or make a little bit of a bowl shape and then fill that with water, and then that'll slowly seep down towards the center. A couple 5-gallon buckets worth, based on the pile size, but something like that.
Okay, cool. And I don't know, my other question, shoot, frick, I don't forgot what I was gonna ask next. So if we were to use logs to kind of build a bin instead, like how much would it be best to have the logs stack up on each other so it's really not much space, or like would you just prefer, or would it be best to actually use pallets instead of logs?
I would say pallets are better than log.
Okay.
You could, you want to have, it's nice aesthetically, it's really comes down to aesthetics ultimately, but like having the pallets for the sides and the back, it looks neat and tidy. You could get creative and make it look nice with logs. But you just, essentially the idea of a bin is like, it's contained and it looks more aesthetically pleasing. Like, we don't like the open pile, like you don't necessarily have to even have a bin if you have enough area to work with, but it doesn't look so nice. So
okay. And how long does it usually take for it to turn into finished compost?
You can get, if you build, if you did the layering system and you had a good ratio, you had your ratios right, it can happen in a few months.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, as soon as a few months, as long as 6 months, depending on, and if you turned it more often, it'll go quicker.
Okay. And with the finished compost, like after those 6 months, will we be able to so I read somewhere, maybe someone said like we can't, it might burn the roots if we use compost too soon. Someone said something like that. It could just be a myth, but
no. So you would want to likely that the compost in this fashion is not going to be super high in nitrogen, and that's where your concern about burning would be.
Oh, okay.
You're incorporating into the soil around the plants. You don't want it to be actually like touching the plant itself, just more of the soil around the base of the plants. And just incorporating into the top layer of the soil right before you doing the planting is another reason. So how soon after? So like after you sifted it, I would say, maybe leave it for a week or two and then it's ready to go. Usually I'll sift it and it seems pretty, if you smell it and it smells just like earthy, then it's not super high in nitrogen. If it had a really kind of intense smell, then I would maybe let it set for a while, but I wouldn't expect that to be a problem.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
In using the compost bins, I brought it, so I will be using it. Do you have to add organisms or worms or whatever, or do they just, okay.
No, you don't need to. Really everybody that you want to come to the party is kind of already present on all of those things. Just like when you leave an apple on the table or you leave a tomato on the table for long enough and it starts to decompose. It's those same critters that are doing the work for making the compost. So yeah, there's products out there, there's compost activators and stuff like that, but it's unnecessary.
What's the ratio of brown to green again?
3 parts brown to 1 part green.
Okay, thank you.
Paper towels and tissue, can that go in the compost?
Generally speaking, a little bit is probably okay, but not a lot.
Okay.
Like tissue, I think would just kind of get messy and like it's bleached, basically tissues and paper towels are bleached carbon, so there's not a whole lot going on there that's very beneficial to the compost pile itself.
Okay.
So I don't like, people also talk about like shredded paper and stuff too as a carbon source. And though it may work, it's like it just kind of it blows all over and it just kind of looks like garbage. It looks trashy. It doesn't, it again, aesthetically, it's not very I mean, I guess it's contained, but so for those few reasons, I generally wouldn't recommend it. We have a question here in the chat for cardboard. Do you suggest the non-shiny ones? So yeah, you want to, if you're using cardboard, you don't want to use waxed cardboard or any cardboard with like, ideally it's like just the brown cardboard for like the lasagna gardening. Not any kind of not any of that shiny or magazine type material. Okay. Okay, anybody else? You guys know what to do? You got it?
I have a question. This is
Yes.
Anna.
Yeah.
I don't have a big enough garden for the amount of compost that we produce. If we have extras, is it necessary to sift it? And then what other suggestions might you have for, because we're mostly using it as a waste stream diversion. So having extra compost, what would you do with it?
The source materials?
Even the final product, like my garden is pretty small, so
Yeah.
probably don't need all of it.
Right. Well, I mean, you can use it in your landscaping too. If you have perennials, they'll benefit from compost. Trees, ornamentals, shrubs, you could incorporate it there. Otherwise, maybe see if any of your neighbor, there's not really, see if your neighbors might be interested, or if there's like a local community garden you could bring it to. If you're, those would be a few ideas that come to mind. Okay, well, we were going to maybe have somebody join us to talk about, kind of a more involved composting program. But she wasn't going to be around she was planning on jumping on in about 20 minutes. So I think, I guess we'll just keep it rolling for a minute. If we definitely want to make sure that all your questions are answered. And if this is also a time to chat. Like if you got things on your mind other than composting, we could open that up for conversation there as well. Otherwise, we can wrap things up in a little bit here. You guys feeling good?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
When this is Sharon Matthews, when is
Yeah.
the store going to open, the farm store again?
I believe it's like this weekend.
Mm-hmm.
I might be live now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think I just got an email saying that the 22nd they open?
Oh, that will be today.
Yeah.
Yes,
Oh, yesterday.
Yeah.
Mhm.
What's the farm store?
We have an online store where folks can purchase produce from farmers that, basically grown in Detroit produce. So people growing around the city or produce from the Keep Growing Detroit farm.
Oh, wow, okay.
Keto
Yeah.
is the transplants that I picked up on the 14th. I think I put them in and out outside, but I have I think it's collard greens or something that's real tiny. Will they still be able to go outside in the ground?
Maybe it's the lettuce.
You know what? It might be the lettuce.
Because I know my lettuce was still kind of small.
Yeah.
They should do okay. They're a little small, but lettuce grows pretty quickly, and especially if we continue to have days like today, they're gonna perk up real quick.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Thank you.
Yeah, I noticed the same thing. They're really small, and I was worried about that too. Other thing is when I picked up products, which I thank you all for, I didn't notice I didn't get any tomatoes. Is there any reason why?
Too soon.
Because that's just the cold crops.
Yeah, right.
Hot crop pickup is gonna be in May.
Ah,
Yeah.
I'm new at this.
Yeah, make sure you budget more space because you got more plants coming.
Oh, Keto, would these cold crops be done in time before it get too hot?
Well, I mean, depends on what it is. Some of those crops will, like the collards and the kale, for instance, will they'll keep producing through the summer. And then some of the other things like lettuce, lettuce is kind of a one and done thing. So you're going to be, those will be done in another 2 or 3 weeks, I would suspect. It's usually 30-40 days. So maybe up to a month.
Okay. Good.
What about the strawberries? That's a cold crop. Will that produce throughout the summer as well?
Strawberries should I believe the variety that we have this year is an everbearing variety, so those should be, those are perennial too, so yes, they'll, you might get a few strawberries this year. They'll probably really start to shine next year.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Okay, well, I guess if we don't have any more questions, hopefully I gave you the information that you needed to get your compost pile going. It's it's something that anybody can do, and I think everybody, we covered a lot of baseline materials here. I will be sharing the slides and the recording with everybody via email after the class, and I think we'll go ahead and sign off for the day.
All right.
Okay. Enjoy
Thank
your day.
you.
All right, enjoy this
Bye.
weather, guys. Get out there and build your compost pile.
Okay.
All right. Bye, guys.
Bye.